I was folding tiny onesies when the certified letter arrived, my swollen belly making it impossible to bend properly as I reached for the mail slot. The return address made my blood run cold. Morrison and Associates, Legal Services. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope, and the words seemed to blur together before snapping into sharp, devastating focus. Notice to quit. 30 days to vacate the premises. Failure to comply will result in formal eviction proceedings. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, as if sensing my distress, and I had to grip the kitchen counter to steady myself. 9 months pregnant, 2 weeks from my due date, and my mother-in-law was having me evicted from the house I'd lived in for 3 years. The house where I'd painted the nursery pale yellow, where I'd installed safety locks on every cabinet, where I'd built what I thought was going to be my family's home. My name is Bella Wallace Chandler. I'm 29 years old, and until this moment, I thought I understood the woman who raised my husband. I'd sacrificed my legal career when David deployed overseas, choosing to work part-time as a paralegal so I could manage the household and prepare for our first child. I'd been the dutiful daughter-in-law, cooking Sunday dinners, remembering birthdays, listening to endless stories about David's childhood, while my own ambitions sat quietly on hold. The eviction notice bore yesterday's date. Margaret had filed this paperwork while I was at my final prenatal appointment, probably timing it perfectly so I'd receive it when I was most vulnerable, most unable to fight back. But what made my chest tighten with fury wasn't just the timing, it was the reasoning listed in the legal documents. Violation of lease terms due to unauthorized occupancy and property damage. Lies. Complete calculated lies from a woman who'd hugged me just last Sunday and asked if I needed help setting up the bassinet. I was standing in the kitchen of our little rental house on Maple Street, the same kitchen where Margaret had taught me to make David's favorite apple pie, where she'd insisted on hosting my baby shower just 2 months ago. The afternoon sun streamed through the window I'd hung cheerful yellow curtains in, illuminating the neat stack of legal documents that were about to turn my world upside down. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was surrounded by the life I'd carefully built, wearing one of David's old shirts that barely stretched over my belly, holding papers that could destroy everything. Mrs. Henderson from next door was watering her garden and noticed me standing frozen in the doorway. "Bella, honey, you look pale. Everything all right?" Her voice was gentle, concerned, and I realized I must look as shocked as I felt. I managed a weak smile and told her I was just tired, that the baby was keeping me up. She nodded sympathetically and went back to her roses, but I caught her glancing at me with worry as I slowly closed the door. The baby's movements became more insistent, as if picking up on my stress, and I forced myself to breathe deeply. My first instinct was to call David, but he was somewhere in the Middle East where communication was sporadic and expensive. My second instinct was to call Margaret directly to ask what the hell she thought she was doing. But something made me pause, made me think like the lawyer I'd trained to be rather than the frightened pregnant woman I felt like in that moment. Truth is, I wasn't completely surprised. I'd been noticing things about Margaret for months now, subtle changes that I'd dismissed as normal mother-in-law boundary issues. She'd been asking increasingly pointed questions about our finances, wanting to know how much I made as a paralegal, whether David was sending money home, how we could afford the baby expenses. At first, I'd attributed it to grandmotherly concern, but the questions had an edge to them, a probing quality that made me uncomfortable. She'd also been coming by the house more frequently, always with some excuse, bringing groceries, checking on my pregnancy, wanting to help with household projects. But I'd started noticing her opening mail that wasn't addressed to her, looking through drawers when she thought I wasn't watching, even photographing certain rooms with her phone when I was in the bathroom. When I'd asked about the photos, she'd laughed it off, saying she wanted to remember how I'd decorated the nursery. The visits had increased after David's deployment, sometimes daily, often without calling first. She'd started showing up with her own key, claiming David had given it to her for emergencies. I'd felt uncomfortable about it, but hadn't wanted to cause family drama, especially with David so far away and unable to mediate. Margaret had always been controlling with her son, but I'd assumed marriage and distance would naturally create boundaries. Then there were the conversations with strangers. Twice in the past month, I'd come home to find Margaret on the porch talking to people I didn't recognize, official-looking people with clipboards and measuring tapes. When I'd asked who they were, she'd been vague, mentioning something about insurance assessments or property evaluations. I'd trusted her explanations because why wouldn't I? She was my husband's mother, my baby's grandmother, someone who'd welcomed me into the family with open arms. The phone calls had changed too. Margaret used to chat about neighborhood gossip, family news, her book club meetings. Lately, her conversations were peppered with comments about how expensive babies were, how young couples struggled financially, how military wives often couldn't handle the stress of deployment. She'd started suggesting that maybe I should move back with my parents in California until David returned, just to have help with the baby. At the time, I'd thought she was being considerate. Now I realized she'd been laying groundwork. Looking back, I could see the pattern clearly. Margaret had been building a case against me, documenting everything she could twist into evidence of my unsuitability as a tenant. That photo of the nursery wasn't sentimental. It was evidence that I'd made unauthorized modifications to the property. Those strangers with clipboards weren't insurance assessors. They were probably investigators or process servers. Every friendly visit had been reconnaissance. Every concerned question, a probe for ammunition. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. While I'd been working part-time as a paralegal, I'd kept my law license active. While she thought I was just David's pregnant wife, I'd been quietly maintaining my professional networks, staying current on tenant rights legislation, even taking continuing education courses online during my evening hours. Margaret knew I'd gone to law school, but she thought of it as something I'd abandoned when I got married, not something that remained a core part of who I was. So I made some quiet moves of my own. First, I photographed every page of the eviction documents, then scanned them to my secure cloud storage. I documented the condition of every room in the house, taking time-stamped photos that clearly showed the property was well-maintained and undamaged. I gathered every piece of correspondence I'd had with Margaret, every text message, every email, creating a comprehensive digital file that painted a very different picture than the one she was trying to present in court. I also started keeping a detailed journal of her visits, documenting times, purposes, and any unusual behavior. I printed copies of all our rental payments, utility bills, and maintenance requests, proving that we'd been model tenants. Most importantly, I pulled our original lease agreement and studied every clause, every addendum, every legal requirement that Margaret needed to meet for a valid eviction. The more I researched, the more irregularities I found in her legal filing. She'd failed to provide proper notice of lease violations. She hadn't followed the correct timeline for eviction proceedings. Most damning of all, she'd listed reasons for eviction that were either completely false or legally insufficient. Margaret might have thought she was dealing with a naive young woman, but she was actually attempting to defraud someone who'd graduated in the top 10% of her law school class. I spent the next 3 days conducting a thorough investigation of my legal position, and what I discovered was even worse than I'd initially realized. Margaret hadn't just filed an eviction notice. She'd been systematically building a false case against me for months. The property damage she'd cited referred to normal wear and tear that any court would dismiss. The unauthorized occupancy claim was baseless, since David was listed on the lease and military deployment didn't void tenancy rights. But as I dug deeper into the legal documents, I found something that made my blood boil. Margaret had also filed a claim for unpaid rent, dating back 6 months, complete with forged documentation, suggesting we'd been behind on payments. She'd apparently planned to not only evict me, but also sue for thousands of dollars in supposed damages and unpaid fees. This wasn't just an attempt to get me out of the house. It was a calculated attempt to destroy my family's financial stability while my husband was serving overseas. I realized I needed professional backup, someone who could guide me through the process and ensure I handled everything correctly. I contacted Linda Rodriguez, a tenants' rights attorney I'd known since law school, who now specialized in military family legal issues. When I explained my situation, her response was immediate and furious. "Bella, this isn't just an illegal eviction. This is fraud," Linda said during our video call, her voice tight with anger as she reviewed the documents I'd sent. "Your mother-in-law has filed false claims, forged documentation, and violated at least 6 different tenant protection laws. The fact that you're military family makes this even more serious. There are federal protections specifically designed to prevent this kind of exploitation." Linda's analysis revealed that Margaret had violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which provides specific protections for military families against eviction and legal proceedings during deployment. She'd also committed fraud by submitting false documentation to the court, and she'd violated state tenant protection laws by failing to provide proper notice and legal justification for eviction. "The question is," Linda continued, "how far do you want to take this? We could simply fight the eviction and win easily. But given the systematic nature of her fraud and the forged documents, we could also file criminal charges and pursue civil damages. This woman tried to make you homeless while you're 9 months pregnant and your husband is deployed. That's not just illegal, it's unconscionable." As we talked through my options, I realized this was bigger than just my individual case. Linda told me she'd been seeing an increase in similar situations, family members exploiting military deployments to take advantage of spouses left behind. If Margaret was willing to do this to her own daughter-in-law, she'd probably done it before or would do it again to someone else. I decided to fight back with everything I had. Not just for myself and my baby, but for every military spouse who might find themselves in a similar position. Linda agreed to represent me pro bono, viewing the case as an opportunity to set legal precedent and send a message that this kind of predatory behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The next phase of our investigation revealed the true scope of Margaret's deception. Linda's team discovered that this wasn't Margaret's first attempt at fraudulent eviction. She'd previously owned rental properties and had been cited twice by the City Housing Authority for illegal eviction practices. She'd also been involved in a lawsuit 5 years earlier where former tenants successfully sued her for discrimination and fraud. Most shocking of all, we found evidence that Margaret had been planning this for months, possibly since before David's deployment was even announced. She'd consulted with a property management company about reclaiming the house for family use and had been researching market rates for similar properties in the area. It appeared she wanted to evict us so she could either sell the property or rent it for significantly more money to someone else. Linda's team also uncovered communication between Margaret and the Morrison law firm that revealed the extent of her dishonesty. She'd provided them with a completely fictional account of our tenancy, claiming we'd been problematic renters who'd damaged the property and repeatedly violated lease terms. She'd even suggested that my pregnancy was making me unstable, and therefore a risk to the property. The investigation expanded when Linda contacted the Military Family Advocacy Program on our base. They confirmed that Margaret's actions violated multiple federal statutes designed to protect service members and their families. A representative from the program, Captain Martinez, agreed to serve as an official witness to the military family impact of Margaret's fraud. At this point, I realized we needed to involve local authorities as well. Linda helped me file complaints with the Housing Authority, the State Attorney General's office, and the Police Department's Fraud Division. Each agency was horrified by the systematic nature of Margaret's deception and the vulnerability of her target, a pregnant military wife whose husband was deployed overseas. The scope of the case continued to expand as more evidence emerged. The Housing Authority found that Margaret had been operating rental properties without proper licensing and had failed to maintain required safety standards. The Attorney General's office discovered she'd been reporting fraudulent income on her tax returns related to rental properties. The police found evidence that she'd committed mail fraud by intercepting and opening correspondence addressed to David and me. Linda also connected me with a network of other military spouses who'd faced similar exploitation. 3 other women came forward with stories of family members or landlords attempting to take advantage of them during deployments. Their cases weren't as extreme as mine, but they showed a pattern of people targeting military families during their most vulnerable periods. The media attention began when Captain Martinez recommended the case to a journalist who specialized in military family issues. The story of a pregnant military wife being fraudulently evicted by her own mother-in-law while her husband served overseas struck a nerve with both military and civilian communities. Local news stations picked up the story, and it quickly gained national attention through military family advocacy organizations. By this point, Margaret probably realized she'd bitten off more than she could chew. Through Linda, she attempted to negotiate a quiet resolution, offering to withdraw the eviction notice and forget the whole thing if I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. But it was far too late for that. The fraud had been too systematic, the potential consequences too severe, and the broader implications too important to simply ignore. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Margaret showed up at my house on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after I'd received the eviction notice, clearly agitated and desperate. She'd obviously been contacted by multiple agencies and legal representatives, and she was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. I was prepared for her visit. Linda had coached me on exactly how to handle any direct contact, and I had recording equipment set up throughout the house to document any threats or admissions. Margaret's timing was perfect from a legal standpoint. She'd walked directly into the trap we'd been setting for weeks. "Bella, we need to talk," Margaret said, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. "I think there's been some misunderstandings about the house situation. Maybe we can work something out between family." Her voice carried a pleading tone I'd never heard before, and she kept glancing around nervously as if she suspected she was being monitored. She was right to be nervous. Within hours of her arrival, Linda's team had coordinated with local police to have unmarked units positioned around the block. Captain Martinez was monitoring from the base, ready to provide immediate military family advocacy support. The fraud division detective assigned to the case was listening to a live audio feed, documenting any admissions or threats Margaret might make. Margaret's desperation became increasingly obvious as she tried to convince me to drop what she called this legal nonsense. She offered to pay for all my baby expenses, to help with childcare when the baby arrived, even to let me live in the house rent-free until David returned from deployment. But every offer came with the condition that I withdraw all legal complaints and keep this between family. The most damning moment came when Margaret actually admitted to fabricating evidence. "Those photos I took of the nursery," she said, "I might have exaggerated the damage in my report. You know how lawyers make everything sound worse than it is. Maybe I was just worried about the property value." It was a complete confession to fraud, recorded on multiple devices, with law enforcement listening in real time. Margaret also revealed the financial motivation behind her actions. She'd been struggling with her own debt and had seen the house as an easy way to generate more income. She'd planned to evict us, then rent the property for nearly double what we were paying, using the higher market rates that had developed in our neighborhood over the past year. My pregnancy and David's deployment had seemed like perfect timing to her. She'd assumed I'd be too overwhelmed and isolated to fight back effectively. The intervention happened exactly as Linda had planned. Detective Chandler from the Fraud Division arrived with backup officers, presenting Margaret with a warrant for her arrest on charges of fraud, filing false legal documents, and mail theft. The look of shock on her face when she realized the extent of the case against her was almost satisfying enough to make up for the stress she'd put me through. Margaret was taken into custody while I stood in the doorway of the home she'd tried to steal from me. The house that was now legally secure for my family, the nursery that was protected from her lies, the life that she'd nearly destroyed with her greed and deception. Watching her being led away in handcuffs while explaining my rights as a crime victim was a moment of justice I'll never forget. The legal resolution came swiftly once Margaret's crimes were fully documented. She pled guilty to fraud, forgery, and violations of federal military family protection laws to avoid a lengthy federal trial. Her sentence included restitution for all legal fees and damages, community service with military family advocacy organizations, and prohibition from owning or managing rental properties for 5 years. The civil lawsuit Linda filed on my behalf was settled for a substantial amount that ensured financial security for my growing family. Margaret was also required to publicly apologize through local media and military family organizations, acknowledging her crimes and encouraging other military families to seek help if they faced similar exploitation. Most importantly, the case resulted in stronger enforcement of existing protections for military families and increased awareness of the vulnerabilities they face during deployment. Captain Martinez told me that my case had become a teaching example used in military family advocacy training across multiple bases. 2 weeks after Margaret's arrest, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl in the same hospital where Margaret had once promised to be my support system during delivery. Instead, Linda was there holding my hand while I called David with the news that his daughter had arrived safely in the home we'd successfully defended. The room was filled with flowers from military family advocacy groups, local veterans organizations, and neighbors who'd followed our story in the media. The experience transformed my perspective on justice, family, and my own capabilities. I'd spent months feeling like a victim, letting someone else control my family's future because I wanted to keep peace and avoid conflict. But when pushed to the absolute limit, I'd found the strength and skills to fight back effectively. My law degree hadn't been abandoned when I chose to support my husband's military career. It had just been waiting for the moment when I needed it most. The broader impact of our case continues to grow. Linda and I now work together on military family advocacy, helping other spouses navigate legal challenges during deployment. We've spoken at conferences about recognizing and responding to family exploitation, and we've helped draft stronger legislation to protect military families from predatory behavior. Our story has also reached international military communities, and I regularly receive messages from spouses around the world who face similar situations. Some are dealing with financial exploitation by family members. Others are fighting fraudulent evictions or custody challenges. Each one reminds me that standing up to Margaret wasn't just about protecting my own family. It was about proving that military spouses aren't helpless victims waiting for someone to rescue them. Margaret and I will probably never speak again, and I'm completely at peace with that reality. She taught me that family relationships built on control and exploitation aren't worth preserving, and that protecting my child means setting clear boundaries about what behavior I'll accept from anyone, regardless of their relationship to us. When David returned from deployment to meet his 6-month-old daughter, he found a stronger family than the one he'd left behind. We were living securely in our home, financially stable from the lawsuit settlement, and connected to a community of advocates and supporters we'd never known existed. The woman he'd married had discovered she was capable of fighting battles he'd never imagined she'd need to face. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd simply accepted Margaret's eviction notice, packed up our belongings, and moved back to my parents' house as she'd probably expected. My daughter would have been born in a different state. David would have returned to find his family scattered and traumatized, and Margaret would have gotten away with her fraud while likely targeting other military families in the future. Instead, she learned that the pregnant daughter-in-law she'd underestimated was exactly the wrong person to try to cheat. And my daughter will grow up knowing that her mother never backed down from a fight that mattered, especially when it came to protecting her family's home and future.